Hi, I'm Julia Minamata, and thank you for having me come talk to your class. I'm a game developer, a freelance illustrator, and a pixel artist, and I'm based in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I am going to talk to you today about how I got started in art and pixel art, and how I got started on my game, The Crimson Diamond, as well as what I used to make The Crimson Diamond, and some suggestions of tools that you could use if you are interested in making your own games. So let's get started. Here are some examples of some illustrations that I've made. I was about 10 years into a freelance illustration career. I went to an arts college. I have a Bachelor of Applied Arts Illustration, and I specialized in editorial illustration, which is illustrations for magazines and newspapers. A freelance illustrator basically is self-employed. I would run my own business, and I would send out promotional work, postcards and things to art directors of magazines and newspapers and looking for commissioned artwork. And these are some examples of those. Moving into doing pixel art, I kind of realized that my style was sort of flat and two-dimensional and with a limited color palette to begin with. So for me, switching over to doing pixel art from doing more classical illustration was not too much of a transition. So my formal education is in illustration, but all the stuff that I learned to make the Crimson Diamond was stuff I learned kind of after I was done with school. So a lifetime of learning is what I want to kind of bring home to you guys. It's really important. And here is the project I'm working on currently. It's the Crimson Diamond, and it's a mystery adventure game that's set in Canada. Adventure games are story-based games that are fairly linear and emphasize setting and character and narrative more than anything else. And I'll be showing some examples of some adventure games that you guys could check out on your own later on in the presentation. I am working on this basically by myself. I'm doing the writing and the game design and the programming and the art and animation. The only thing I'm not handling is the music, and I have a wonderful musician, Dan Polakar, who has been making some beautiful original music for the project. So I've been really lucky to have him on too. And to give you an example of the game and the gameplay of the Crimson Diamond, I have a trailer that I can show you guys. So here we go.
Crimson, Ontario was once a prosperous, lively mining town. But that was a long time ago. Now it's quiet, nearly deserted, and some folks aim to keep it that way. Nancy Maple is an aspiring mineralogist assigned to follow the trail of a dazzling diamond. An intriguing cast of characters has converged under one roof, each meaning to get their own way. Or else. Will Nancy untangle the mysteries and machinations before it's too late? Will the sleepy town of Crimson shine once more? Find out in The Crimson Diamond, an upcoming adventure game by Julia Minamata. The Crimson Diamond demo is available on Steam and itch.io for Windows PC and Mac OS.
There we go. So looking at the Crimson Diamond trailer, it gives you an idea of what an adventure game would be like to play, particularly the adventure games that were around in the late 80s and early 90s, which is kind of what I consider the era of the EGA color palette. The EGA color palette is that 16 colors that you see running along the bottom of the screen here. And that's it. And what's actually kind of amazing about it is that you can actually create some wonderful effects in lighting and secondary colors with just these colors using just a few tricks. And I've got 3 examples here. 2 of these are adventure games. On the far left, we have The Colonel's Bequest from 1989. The middle is The Secret of Monkey Island from 1990. And the far right is an action game, an arcade game called Commander Keen 3. Looking at these 3 examples, you can see that the far left, there is no status screen, there's no score or lives meter or ammo meter or anything like that. The Colonel's Bequest is very much about focusing on a story and a mystery, talking to characters, and exploration. The Monkey Island here, The Secret of Monkey Island, is another adventure game. It was slightly different, but you can see that again there are no lives, no high score meter, anything like that. It still emphasizes that beautiful setting. There are characters to talk to, and the way you interact with the game is through these verbs that are along the bottom of the screen, where you have open, close, push, pull, etc. And the Commander Keen here is the one I used as the example of the arcade game where you have a score, lives, and ammo. And you can see there's a sort of a yellow slug that's been stepped on here, and there are some obstacles to jump over. What's kind of cool for me about the EGA color palette is at the time, this color palette, these 16 colors, were used as a result of technological limitations. Because the diskettes that the games were on were very small in terms of capacity, and graphics took up a lot of memory. And so using a small color palette like this EGA color palette helped to keep the game size small. But I know, and I have it on good authority, that the artists of that time were not that fond of this color palette. The artist for The Colonel's Bequest, Doug Herring, and the artist for The Secret of Monkey Island, Mark Ferrari, they both have said to me that they didn't like this color palette. For them, it represented restrictions of what they could do and not do. But for me as a kid growing up in the late 80s and early 90s, playing these games, I never thought that these colors were a result of restrictions. For me, these colors were bright and fun and really filled me with a lot of happy memories. Which is why when I started making the Crimson Diamond, it felt natural for me to gravitate toward these same 16 colors of the EGA color palette. These are all screenshots from the Crimson Diamond, and they're the same colors and the same screen resolution as those old games in the previous slide. What I mean by resolution is that it's 320 by 200 pixels for the whole screen size for the artwork. And I'll get into screen size and resolution in a little bit. But I think the most important thing looking at these screens is that how much I was inspired by the memories that I had when I was a kid. And how I started, this project started as a hobby project. And it started with more colors. When I was a freelance illustrator, I was not getting as many commissions as I would have liked, so I had more free time on my hands. I discovered how to create pixel art in Photoshop CS2, and I immediately started to try to recreate artwork that I remember from adventure games that I enjoyed when I was younger. The first example was these two portraits at the bottom left, speech portraits, of a close-up of a woman talking, and I used a bunch of different colors in this example, but the one on the right here, I reduced the color palette of the portrait. I immediately liked it better, which kind of got me thinking about what about if I use that specific color palette of EGA, which is what this room is here. This is the first EGA room I ever made, and I used The Colonel's Bequest as a starting point because it was my favorite EGA color palette game from that time, and it was set in a plantation house, which had a lot of beautiful rooms with a lot of great light and shadow. I used that a lot in my example here. But what I realized is that after I created the character after the fact, that the furniture in this room was not created to scale, which means the furniture is actually much bigger and deeper than the character is. Even the books on this shelf here are very large, and these couches and things. So the second room I made for the Crimson Diamond game was this kitchen on the far left, and I started it based around that Nancy Maple, the main character, the Nancy Maple sprite, making sure that all the cupboards and chairs and tables were all at kind of the right height for her size. And I continued to make more rooms and more rooms for the Crimson Lodge, which is the main setting for the game. And I started learning Adventure Game Studio to start connecting these rooms together, to animate the character, and all the other things that kind of make the setting come to life. At this point, I was not thinking about making a game per se. I was more interested in this is a hobby project where I was building a house, a dollhouse out of pixels. But as I started going, I wanted to have the character walk around in the house. I wanted her to be able to walk around the furniture. I wanted her to open a door and open a cupboard and see what was inside. I slowly started to teach myself Adventure Game Studio, which is the game engine that I've been using for the Crimson Diamond, just to do those things and not really thinking about anything else beyond that. But as I was building the actual lodge, I started to think in the back of my head about story and character ideas. I started to think, who is this character I have walking around in this lodge? Why is she here? Why is the lodge here? Who built the lodge? All these questions were starting to pop up in my mind, and I kind of wanted to answer them for myself. Which leads us to the setting. Crimson Diamond is a fictional town that is in Ontario, Northern Ontario. It's based on Canadian ghost towns and local history. I have an interest in this type of thing. I love local history. When I go to anywhere, when I visit any place, town, small or large, I love to see their art galleries and museums because I like to see the really grounded local heritage of the place and artifacts from that place and how it got started and how it's continued through the ages. Because a lot of places, a lot of ghost towns in Canada, they didn't last, especially in the time that the Crimson Diamond is set, which was the late 1800s, early 1900s. There were a lot of places, for instance, that were mining towns or timber towns, like for wood mills and stuff like that. And Crimson Ontario, the town I created, I wanted it to be geologically and mineralogically realistic. I wanted it to be set as a place that used to be a mining town, but then became a ghost town because the mine ended up not being that profitable. Part of my research was involved with where in Ontario were there diamonds and are there diamonds, and there actually are working diamond mines in Ontario. So for me, it was cool because I knew kind of the exact region I wanted to set the game, even though the town itself never existed. Research informs every aspect of the game: story, art, character, puzzles. A lot of my own interests are wrapped up in the game, so the research part was a real pleasure for me. I got to learn more about what I'm interested in, and as I learned more about what I was interested in, I was able to create a setting that was grounded and realistic, and I could create characters with realistic motivations and personalities. Here is a photograph of me at Adventure X in London. I showed the Crimson Diamond there, and this is the British Library in London. I printed off this huge retractable banner made in that EGA color palette. And it was really cool because I would be sitting at this table or standing at this table, and I would watch people walk by the table, and I would wait for a person I would wait for a person to walk by the banner, see it, and have their eyes light up in recognition. A lot of people at Adventure X, because it's a narrative-focused games event, a lot of people remember the same games I grew up with, and to see their faces light up and with those memories and the recognition was really exciting for me and motivating. I knew that I could then follow up with, hey, do you recognize this style of art from anywhere? Have you played any games in this style before? And we would get into a great conversation about fond memories they had of that type of game. But showing the game at the event also, I learned that it's not only people who have fond memories and nostalgia for this color palette and this particular style of artwork, but there were people that were younger that had never played a game that looked like this, that also it caught their eye and they wanted to find out more about it because it is a very unique, the EGA color palette is a very unique color palette. And it's super bright. It doesn't get any brighter. It's super eye-catching, and it was really fun to see people, young and old, get interested and excited. I speak about nostalgia as my inspiration, but I'm certainly not alone in that. There are lots of game developers who became game developers because they have such fond memories of the games they played growing up and used that inspiration for their own projects. One of these examples is the top right here, Return of the Oberdin, that came out in 2018. And Lucas Pope, who created this game, is very much inspired by the graphics of black and white Apple II games. For instance, we have Dark Castle from 1986. Shovel Knight, bottom right, was launched in 2016, and it's got an aesthetic that is clearly inspired by console action platformers of the Super Nintendo era. For example, Mega Man X from 1993. The thing is I would say that sure, maybe a lot of their audience is inspired and would recognize this style of artwork, but that's certainly not what they're counting on. They're counting on the strength of the style to be eye-catching, even for people who have never played Dark Castle, who've never played Mega Man X. Pixel art is a wonderful genre of art that I think has a lot of good things going for it, not just nostalgia. One of those things is it's an efficient art style. Efficient. This example is the Dark Side Detective. The very tiny image here you have on the top the top left is the result of a 12-hour game prototype. The game jam resolution for their game was 142 by 80 pixels, so very, very small. When they decided to commercially release the Dark Side Detective, they thought they would completely redo the art style. But they had such a positive reaction from the art style that they just decided they're going to scale up the artwork by 400% and add some lighting effects to great effect. I think it's a beautiful looking game. Dark Side Detective is a wonderful mystery adventure game. The great thing about the pixel art is, yes, it can be made quickly, which means that small teams can make great games at low budgets, and in the low resolution, which we'll get into in a little bit, the low resolution of the graphics also means that the graphics can be produced fairly quickly and easily. I've got some examples here. Top left is Lamplight City by Francisco Gonzalez. Took 2 years of development time with 10 hours of gameplay. 10 hours of gameplay is pretty average for what would be considered a full-length adventure game. Bottom left, we have Unavowed by Wadjet Eye Games. It's about 7 people. It can be hard to estimate how many people worked on a game because, while it might have been 1 or 2 full-time people, there are often contract workers that come in for additional art or localization, that type of thing. There's approximately 7 people, 2 years of development time, and again 10 hours of gameplay. Top right, we have Kathy Rain, which was developed by about 5 people. It took 1 year development full-time. It would have. The developer, Yostov Hosto, has said that it was about 4 years part-time, but if it had all been boiled down to 1 year of full-time development, with another 10 hours of gameplay. And, of course, the Crimson Diamond, which is not out yet, it will hopefully have taken 3 years of development time, with 7 to 10 hours of gameplay. Lamplight City has a game resolution of 640 by 400 pixels. So does Unavowed. Kathy Rain is 320 by 240 pixels, and the Crimson Diamond is 320 by 200 pixels, which was the standard size that was the old adventure games from back in the day. So let's take a look at screen resolutions. When people talk about buying TVs, they talk a lot about 720p, 1080p, 4K monitors. 720p was considered standard HD. 1080p is full HD. 1080p means 1920 by 1080 pixels. 4K is even bigger. I didn't even put it on this screen. But what we're concerned about is the resolution for Lamplight City and Unavowed is 640 by 400 pixels. So the resolution for Kathy Rain and the Crimson Diamond is about 320 by 200 pixels. And the resolution for that 12-hour game jam prototype for the Dark Side Detective was 142 by 80 pixels. It's clear to see that 320 by 200 pixels is about half the size of a 640 by 400 pixel game. But monitors and screens tend to be one size, so what happens when you have a game that's smaller, these smaller rectangles, they will get enlarged, they'll get stretched to fit over a bigger screen, which means that the art gets enlarged as well, and if it's pixel art, the enlarged pixels become blockier looking, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Let's take a look at low resolution graphics. So I've made these kind of mock-ups that kind of stand in for 320 by 200 pixels, but I've made this 32 by 20 pixels. And the other example here is 64 by 40 pixels. If you take a look at the smaller example here, the upper left, it has about the same pixel size as the bottom right 64 by 40 pixel size. But if we enlarge the 32 by 20 pixel image to the same screen size as the 64 by 40 pixels, we enlarge it by 200%. What we get is larger, chunkier pixels than what is seen at 64 by 40. There is less ability to create detail in that size as well. But I will keep pointing out that's not necessarily a bad thing to have chunky graphics with very visible pixels. And in fact, having visible pixels is one of those things that can create an effect that I really love, that I use quite a bit in the Crimson Diamond for the art. And here's an example of that. We have day and night and different kinds of lighting conditions in the Crimson Diamond. These screenshots all use the same 16 color EGA color palette that's on the left side of the screen. These 6 here on the left, all of this carriage house, all were lighting tests because the Crimson Diamond has a daytime and a nighttime, and I wanted the exterior shots of the game to reflect the different lighting conditions. What you might find, particularly in these two middle images, is that there looks like there are colors that are being used in these two screenshots in the middle that aren't present in this 16 color palette. But what's cool about this that I'll show you soon on a close-up is these are not extra colors that I'm using. What this is a process called dithering, which is a checkerboard pattern of 2 colors to create the effect of a third color. So zooming in into those areas, what we have here is it's pretty clear to see that on these red double doors on the left, we have pixels. You can kind of make them out. You have a dark gray and red pixel pattern. So it's a checkerboard pattern. These are all squares. And on the right-hand side, we have that same checkerboard pattern, but the checkerboard instead is dark cyan and dark red. But when we look at it from afar, those two different sets of colors look like they could be a third color, a different color than what is shown in the EGA color palette. But once you zoom in, you can see that we're not adding any extra colors. It's just the effect that the eye creates when it blends those two colors together. Another cool thing is that this dark cyan on the right-hand side for the grass is also present in the grass on the left-hand side, but the dark cyan is dithered. There's a checkerboard pattern here that's very faint and very subtle with the green. Looking at the dark green here on the upper right of these 6 images, and just below it, this dark cyan, those two colors are being blended together in a checkerboard pattern to create this third color. It's kind of hard to see, but I'll give an example in this next slide here. Here is an example of 16 color dithers and this display size and the effect that you can get. This 16 by 16 grid, 16 unit by 16 unit grid, represents all the color possibilities with 2 color dither combinations. There are 256 color combinations, and when you look at it from this far away, they just pretty much look like solid colors. But if we take these 8 squares on the bottom left, and we zoom in, and we enlarge them, we can see that you can just start making out these checkerboard patterns. And these checkerboard patterns all are only ever made up of 2 of these colors here along the bottom right. When we enlarge one of these checkerboard patterns even further, it's pretty clear to see what is creating that effect. It is this bright red and bright green color. But when we get it smaller, it starts to become a third color. When you get even smaller, it absolutely looks like the effect of a solid color. But my favorite thing about working at a low resolution, 320 by 200 pixels, is that you can see the effect of a third color being created, but you can also see that checkerboard pattern, which to me shows that magic that I mentioned before that I enjoy so much about having this color dither. An example of, not really an example of dither, but a similar effect is Georges Seurat and his Pointillism style. Here is a close-up of a detail of a painting here on the right-hand side of a man, and this man consists of a bunch of colored dots here on the left. They're colored dots, so when you zoom in really close, they just look like a bunch of colored dots. But when you look when you zoom out a little bit, you can start to make out a man, shape, color, shadow, and the effect of additional colors just by the eye merging and blending these colors together. Georges Seurat, his goal with Pointillism was to preserve the brilliance of the colors. When you have the colors pure as they are, they stay very bright. But once you start blending colors as you would do in a regular painting, those colors get less brilliant just because when you blend 2 pigments together, you'll end up getting a more subdued pigment. And so his goal was to preserve that brilliance, and I feel that dithering in EGA pixel art also does a good job of preserving that brilliance, because we're not blending the colors, we're just putting them in close proximity with each other. And now on the right, we have the full painting as it would be seen if you were in a gallery, and the colors really do start to blend together to create an effect that once you get really close, can't really see it as well. But it's all there, and it gives the painting a bit of a glow. I'd like to just go into a little bit of art history now, talking about prototypical pixel art. Pixel art is defined as electronic art, digitally produced art. But I'd like to think that in all the ages of art that have preceded electricity, that there have been styles of art that do remind me quite a bit of pixel art. The first example is this mosaic, the Alexander mosaic from Pompeii from 100 BCE. What I like about this is the picture is made of discrete units of tile that are roughly square. I can't say that this is really pixel art, of course, because there's some places in this mosaic that go sideways, then it's not really based on a grid. But you can see there's a similar effect to Seurat's Pointillism, where you have a bunch of colored tiles in an area that creates the effect of light and shadow through that blending that the eye does. And it's basically, it's this really cool illusion that's being produced. Another example of prototypical pixel art is over Hogdal tapestries from Sweden between 800 and 1100 AD. The tapestry is pretty angular and geometric, these shapes of the animals and the patterns. And that's because this is woven into fabric, and fabric is grid-based, which gives this impression that we have, it's based on squares. It feels like it's based on a unit of squares. Here, let's kind of like the next example, which is cross-stitching, which looks even more close to what we consider pixel art nowadays. This is a McCall's pattern from the 1970s. We have what look like discrete units of color based on a grid pattern, and the effect of creating extra colors with the proximity of 2 or 3 different colors together, so it kind of blends visually. I've created some of my own pixel art for the Crimson Diamond, or of the Crimson Diamond. This is the speech portrait, the portrait of Nancy Maple, the main character. And it's pretty clear that it is, yeah, sure, it's grid-based. We can see the discrete units of the squares. And it's pretty fun to recreate that in the real world with needle and thread. And here's another example of a grid-based piece of pixel art. This is, my mom is doing a patchwork quilt of the Nancy Maple sprite. And we can see that it's built from a bunch of these little squares, these colored squares. And that's just another fun thing I wanted to add in to show that, sure, pixel art is technically digital art, but I think of it as something that goes beyond that. And I think back in history, it's a style that has roots in other places. Going back to the illusion of depth and some of the effects that we can create in pixel art, I wanted to show some examples from the Crimson Diamond. I still have on the left the EGA color palette, and just to the right of that, I've rearranged the color palette from darkest to lightest. White being, of course, the lightest, and black would be the darkest, which is up here. You can't really see it. And on the upper left here, if you kind of squint your eyes to the upper left, you can see that the trees in the background do recede because there's less contrast in the back there, and the shapes of the trees are smaller. There's some dithering that's going on in this background here to give the idea that there's depth in this grass. The size of this rock face, the sizes of these shapes get smaller as we recede, and the highest contrast goes to the front where there's more dark and light and bigger shapes. On the right hand side, your top right, there is an orchard scene, and this orchard has depth in it as well, but I used a different technique to create that depth, where it's not the effect of having a dark forest, it's more of an open, airy type of forest in the back, because I used blue in the background here with a blue dither. This is kind of an example of something called atmospheric perspective, where if something's in the distance, it gets, and especially if it's a sunny, clear day, it gets bluer actually. There gets to be a blue cast on anything that's really far away. So I wanted to recreate that style or that technique. And these apple trees in the foreground are cyan, and it's a lighter color than the other blues in the back, which tends to bring them more forward. The bottom left here, we have this room that has a bit of an illusion of depth in it. A room wouldn't have nearly as much depth as any of these outdoor scenes, but I did want to create the idea that that wall in the back is further back than the other two walls on the left and the right. All I did really to this was I applied a dark gray dither on top of this wallpaper pattern, and I actually swapped out also the color for the flowers in the wallpaper from the light cyan to the dark cyan. There's another creation of depth. This one actually does have a fair amount of depth in it. The bottom right, this hallway scene, I used the same technique where I've made the wall sconces, smaller as they recede. The doorways also get smaller. The carpet here actually recedes in 3 stages. The first stage, closest to us, has the brightest color and the biggest pattern size. The middle stage here is dithered, and the pattern is receding into the background. The third stage of that distance is the pattern is now, you can't see it at all because of that the darkness in the hallway. And I think it actually does a pretty good job of creating excuse me, that effect of depth in a hallway using the same techniques that I used in the other images. And here's an example of the atmospheric perspective that I mentioned before, how the hills and mountains in the back are blue, and they get bluer and less distinct as they move and they recede into the background. Here's light and shadow as can be produced with the EGA color palette. This time on the left, I have organized the EGA color palette into dark and light versions of the colors: light red, dark red, yellow, brown, etc. Looking at this Space Quest 2 screenshot on the upper left, there is this natural light happening where we have this sandy area that is the yellow, but this overhang is creating a shadow on top, and what has been done is the dark color, its neighboring dark color, the brown, is giving the impression that it's a shadow. And of particular interest is the texture that's going on in the sand, where we have white speckles on the sand. When they become shadowed in the shade, they are now dark, the lighter gray, this darker version of the white. And the brown, it's in the lighter area here to show the texture, they went with the black to create that. So what we have here is a recreation of this speckled pattern, but in these two darker colors, to give that impression that there is a shadow being cast here. This bottom left screenshot also from Space Quest 2 shows how we can use lighting, but not necessarily just going with the neighboring darkest adjacent square. This one uses the light magenta for the bright areas and even some white, and the dark area is this dark blue, which is really effective in kind of conveying an otherworldly light. And in these Space Quest games have a lot of really wonderful examples of the creative use of the light side and the dark side of this particular EGA color palette to create those effects. The Colonel's Bequest on the upper right, it's another way to create light and shadow, but this one does it with dithering. We can look at this lawn here. The lawn is green, but there is this black and green dither that is happening on top to create the idea that there is shadow happening on that grass. As well on the wall here of the shaded wall of the house, the dithering is black and dark cyan. On the slightly lighter side of the house, it is light gray and dark cyan. And it's very subtle, but it does give that impression of this dimension of this geometric shape. Of particular interest, I think, is this rounded column where a bunch of different combinations of dithering are used to create that sense of dimension, which can more clearly be seen in the bottom right, which has this beautiful halo effect, this Quest for Glory 2 screenshot, of light to dark using different versions of dithering and different combinations of it. Just looking at this close-up, we have light gray and brown dithering transitions into dark gray and brown dithering, which transitions into black and brown dithering, which is pretty clear to see here, but when we look at it at this regular kind of smaller resolution, you can see it ends up creating this effect of light and dark, where what we've just done is we've swapped a few of these colors in for darker versions of themselves. And here is a step-by-step example of how I would build a screen piece of artwork in the Crimson Diamond. I used a lot of the effects that I discussed already, I tend to add the dithering in last because I want to make the screen work on its own without having it, and then the dithering kind of enhances that effect. Let's see here. I'm going to just move it over to the final piece. In the background, we have the blue, the blue to give that feeling of depth. The blue trees, the silhouettes, and the dithering. We have lower contrast trees in the back, higher contrast trees in the front, smaller trees in the back, and of course larger trees in the front. Of course, the largest being these two closest to us. And they're the highest contrast they're predominantly black here to make them really come forward at us because of their size. And the dithering does create a sense of depth in the scene. What I use for art, I mentioned earlier I use Adobe Photoshop CS2, which is full-featured and powerful. I used it as a freelance illustrator. It can do everything I need it to do. I use it predominantly for the Crimson Diamond as well. It was expensive at the time, which is a major drawback, and it's not easily available now, but it's available as a subscription service with Adobe Creative Cloud. It can be had, well, it's the Adobe Creative Cloud version, of course, not CS2. It can be had for $10 a month, and with the cheapest plan, I believe, $10 US. And so it's actually not too bad. For me, I'm working on an 8-year-old laptop. CS2 is perfect for me. I never really felt a need for anything else, so I never upgraded. Another piece of software I do use, I've been starting to teach myself, is Sprite. Sprite is great because it's specialized pixel art and animation software, which means that it has some features that Photoshop doesn't have. Well, at least Photoshop CS2 doesn't have these features. And it's $20, which I think is a pretty fair price. A lot of pixel artists who work professionally do use Sprite. The third program I use for pixel art is Medibank Paint. It does have a free version. You can get an $8 ad-free version that has some additional features, including being able to export to Photoshop files, which is very key for me because that's definitely what I use the most. It's full-featured and powerful, and it's great for tablets, iPad, and PC, which for me is great when I'm traveling, if I'm on a train and I want to do some work, or if I'm just tired of hunching over my desk. It's a great form factor to just lean back in a different chair and do some work and be able to transfer that quickly and easily over to Photoshop. A good alternative to Photoshop is something called GIMP. It's free and open source. It's as full-featured and powerful as Photoshop, but just as a warning to anyone who is very familiar with Photoshop, as I am, learning GIMP after you're familiar with Photoshop can feel frustrating because it's not exactly the same, and anything that feels a little bit different or works a little bit differently than Photoshop is immediate frustration for me. But I do recommend it if you want something that is a one-stop shop for everything and is free, and so I definitely recommend that. Let's take a quick look at some game development tools. I've only ever used Adventure Game Studio, so I can't really vouch for these, but I wanted to give just a quick overview of some tools just to show the variety that's available, and depending on what genre you're interested in creating, and if you're more of an artist or more of a programmer, there's something out there for you to create games. The first one is Ren'Py. Ren'Py is specially designed to make visual novels. Visual novels are very story-based, very linear, and with an emphasis on art. A good example of a game created in Ren'Py is Doki Doki Literature Club. And this is a free program as well. Twine is another free program if you're interested in interactive fiction, nonlinear storytelling. This one is more for graphic text-based games. An example of a game made in Twine is Depression Quest. It uses flowcharts, as you can see. It seems like it would be pretty easy to use. I know a lot of people do use it. If you're interested more in writing a story and getting it, and it's more text focused, maybe check out Twine. RPG Maker is $80 US, but it has a free trial available. It's specialized for making Japanese RPGs. An example of a game made in RPG Maker is To the Moon. Pico 8 is $15. What's cool about Pico 8 is the previous examples I used, like Ren'Py and Twine, they're very purposely designed for a specific genre of game. And also RPG Maker as well, of course, with specifically making RPGs. Pico 8 is more flexible. You can see these examples. It can be used for making platform games. It can be used for making RPGs. just about anything, I think. You can make something in Pika Weight, and I think it's also the interface is really cute. Adventuron is also free. It's browser based, which means you can design games in just an internet browser, which is really cool. I've never done any games. I've never made any games in Adventuron, but it is. I've judged a game jam that so people made games based around a common theme for a contest, and I judged that. I helped judge that, and I will say, I'm sorry, I will say that a couple first-time developers used Adventuron to create games, and I was very impressed. Adventuron games are text parser adventure games, which is something near and dear to my heart because the Crimson Diamond is also a text parser game, where you interact with the game by typing commands into your keyboard, like open door or get ladder. Adventuron has comprehensive tutorials and documentation, and an exciting aspect to me is that you can play some of those games. It looks like it's pretty easy to optimize the games for mobile, so on phones and things like that. When I was judging the game jam, I was able to play text parser games on my phone for the first time, and it was really cool to be able to do that. I definitely recommend Adventuron. Which brings us to Adventure Game Studio. The examples of games I gave in earlier on in the presentation, like Lamplight City, Unavowed, and Kathy Rain, as well as the Crimson Diamond, are all made in Adventure Game Studio. Adventure Game Studio is a wonderful place to start making adventure games because the way that the editor is organized, it is all organized with the types of assets and folders and things that an adventure game needs to have. If we look at the right-hand side here, if you can make it out, we have inventory items, characters, rooms, and even things like load and save game functions are built into the game, which is wonderful when you're a first-time game maker like I am, and I'm kind of learning programming on the way. And speaking of which, being a first-time programmer, having Adventure Game Studio have an active community and a really active forum where I could post my problems, my technical issues, and have people come up with solutions for them has been really invaluable for me while I'm developing the Crimson Diamond. That's another thing to keep in mind too. It's wonderful when you have an engine like this that has other people using it too who can share experiences, and there's a lot to learn really. The last one I want to touch on briefly is Game Maker, which is $39 for publishing games on Windows and Mac. It is very flexible. It's also one of those ones where it's not specifically tied to a particular genre of game. Two games, standout examples of games made in Game Maker are Undertale and Spelunky, which you may have heard of, both really cool games. This is another one where I think it's really powerful, and it can do just about anything you might want. I just want to quickly mention itch.io. It's a great place to share and sell games. If you're interested in seeing games from small hobbyists to all the way up to really, big production, AAA productions, you can find them on itch.io. I think it's a great place to start if you want to participate in some game jams, for instance, to see what's out there. There's a lot of people posting games for very low prices or free even. You can do the same if you want to build little hobby projects and get feedback. Adventuron has a wonderful itch.io page where there is an abundance of free games to try out on your own. I definitely recommend it as a destination if you're interested in learning about what other types of games there are out there. Which brings us to learning about the Crimson Diamond and how to learn more about that. I do have social media. I have the Crimson Diamond fan page on Facebook. I have at Julia Minamata on Twitter. I also stream. I try to stream once a week on Tuesdays at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And I stream game art. I'll do game art on stream. As well, Dan Polakar, the musician, will compose live on stream and will actually take suggestions and feedback as we're doing it. So that's a fun way for us to get people involved too. I also have a YouTube, Julia Minamata on YouTube, where I post the live streams as videos later. So for people who can't really make the live streams or can't watch the whole thing, I always put them up on there after the fact. In conclusion, I just want to emphasize that EGA color palettes and other limited color palettes are fun to use. They're distinctive, and they can save you time when you're considering making your own game for whatever reason, hobby, for commercial release. It makes it more budget friendly. It makes it easier for you to experiment with making games. If you're not as confident with making art, having a low resolution, limited color palette game means there's less pressure to try to create artwork that it looks realistic. That's not the goal of a lot of the artwork that I make. Guys, I'm trying to make art that symbolizes what that thing is, not realism. And realism is the thing that can take a lot of time and technique to master. And there are tons of game dev tools that cater to a range of skill levels and genres. A lot of them are free or pretty economically priced. Depending on if you're more of an artist or more of a programmer, there is something out there for you if you ever do want to make a game. And there's never been a better time to try making games and to share your efforts with other people. And so thank you for having me speak to you today. There is a demo for the Crimson Diamond available on Steam. If you have any questions, you can email me at julia@thecrimsondiamond.com. And all the social media links that I had mentioned earlier, everything you can find on thecrimsondiamond.com. And yeah, thanks again. I hope you found this useful, and thanks for listening.